It was the sound of a throat being cleared that woke me. I jerked awake in a half-daze. My wrist ached from where I'd been propping my head up, and the taste of congealed chicken coated my tongue. The remnants of the tepid in-flight meal I'd forced down a few hours back. On the screen in front of me, the movie I'd been watching, some old thriller starring Brad Pitt, played soundlessly. My headphones must have fallen onto my lap when I dozed off. Rubbing my eyes on one hand, I gazed out over the sea of blue seats, rows of 3 that stretched towards the curtain at the far end of the aisle. The cabin around me was in that weird, twilight limbo you only really find on planes. Silence blanketed everything. Circular windows looked out on darkness. Passengers lay back against headrests with their mouths half open, heads lolling against their neck pillows. Tired people, desperate to make the time pass as quickly as possible. Trouble sleeping? The voice made me jump. I'd been in my own little world, and I hadn't even noticed the man next to me. The stranger, now occupying the aisle seat, which had definitely been unoccupied when I dozed off. I rubbed my eyes again and blinked at him. The man looked to be around my age, although his shaved head made it hard to tell. He wore dark jeans and a black hoodie. There was nothing that notable about his appearance, other than the angular line of his jaw and his eyes, which were a very light blue, almost grey. "Well, are you?" I glanced up the aisle towards the front of the plane, then looked back at him. "Did you have to move seats or something?" We were sitting right at the back of the plane, near the toilets, on the only row that has 2 seats to a side rather than 3. I'd been one of the first aboard, and I remembered watching the other passengers filing on the plane after me, silently hoping none would claim the seat beside me, and up until now, none of them had. My new companion watched me for a second, not saying anything. I noticed that his lips were turned up slightly, in what I took to be a half smile. "You know what's weird?" he said after a moment. "There are a couple of 100 people on this plane, and you're the only one right now that's awake." "Eh?" "Everyone else in this cabin, I mean." The man lifted an arm and gestured vaguely around us. "They're all dead to this world." I stared at him, unsure I'd heard him correctly. At this point, my head still felt fuzzy from sleep, and I was struggling to concentrate. But before I had a chance to say anything back, the man started speaking again. "Don't you think planes are weird at night? Sort of creepy in a way. People put their headphones in, and they shut their eyes, and they all sort of disappear into themselves. It's like the whole cabin just gets put on pause, a little flying box, miles up in the sky, full of people in limbo. Feels kind of fragile, doesn't it?" I continued staring at the guy, my mind trying to process what he was saying, trying to formulate a response. By this point, I thought I had a pretty good idea of what was happening. It was simple enough, really. The man wasn't all there. That had to be it. He was a couple of playing cards short of a full deck. Maybe not completely crazy or anything, but definitely a bit of a weirdo at the very least. I guessed he might have been hopping around the cabin ever since the seatbelt light went off, chatting away to anyone he could find to listen, voicing his thoughts to people until they lost interest. And now, he'd worked his way back to me. "Yeah, I paused, trying to land on the best reply. I didn't want to be rude to the guy, but at the same time, I really didn't want to get trapped in a conversation. I was tired, my body ached, and all I wanted was to sleep the rest of the flight away. My trip to Mumbai had been a tiring one, and our arrival time in Heathrow had to be another 4 hours off at least. I guess I really never thought about it like that, I said after a moment. I suppose everyone's tired, and they're just keen to get home as quickly as possible, so everyone sleeps. Apart from you. Sorry? Everyone goes to sleep, apart from you. Well, I was asleep. I tried my best to stop the irritation from creeping into my voice, but then I got woken up. The man stared at me with his bluey-grey eyes for a moment longer. Then he smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. His thin lips stretched back, and I caught sight of his teeth, which were a dirty yellow. Okay, you got me there, he said. I suppose I did sort of wake you up, but in my defense, you really don't have long to choose. Choose what? Whether it'll be this one, or whether it gets passed on. The man's smile vanished. He fixed me with cold eyes. There was something sort of unnerving about how quickly his expression changed, how fast his grin was replaced with blankness, and I felt a hint of unease worm its way into my stomach. For the first time since he'd started speaking to me, I found myself wondering if the guy really was just a harmless weirdo looking for a chat. If maybe he wasn't a little further gone than I'd first thought. Dangerous even. And what he said next did absolutely nothing to ease my mind. You don't need to worry about me, the stranger muttered. His face was so skinny, I could see the muscles in his jaw working as he spoke. I'm not going to hurt you. Not unless you give me permission, that is. Cold fingers ran down my back. I tried to keep my voice as calm and level as possible. Look, mate, I'm just minding my own business back here. As I spoke, I found my eyes drifting to the twilight aisle running down the plane, searching for a member of cabin crew. I'm happy to chat to you, but I don't want any trouble or anything like that, okay? No cabin crew in sight. Of course they weren't. When you were trying to settle into the film, they were there every 5 seconds, checking to make sure your damn seatbelt was on. But when you actually needed one, they were nowhere to be seen. I told you. They're asleep, whispered the man. What? The cabin crew, Mike. They're asleep. Everyone's asleep on this plane, but you. He read my mind. That was the first thought that ran through my head. Oh, Jesus, he read my damn mind. And then, off the back of that, and he knows my name. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, pulled in a deep breath. Who are you? I said after a moment. What do you want? The stranger grinned at me, showing another flash of those yellow teeth. I think you know the answer to the first question, he said. And if you don't know it now, I'm sure you'll figure it out. As for what I want... The man looked around the cabin, taking in the rows of sleeping passengers. I want you to make a simple choice, Mike. It's a choice plenty of people have had to make before, if that helps. A choice your philosophers have been arguing about for centuries too. He turned back to me and locked his pale eyes on mine. It's like I said to you before. It's either this one or it gets passed on. There's no other way. But what? I tried to stop my voice from shaking and failed. What gets passed on? You know. No, I don't know. I don't understand what... We don't have time, Mike. You need to make your choice. It's like a DVD, see? I can keep it on pause for a while, but if I leave it too long, the whole thing will shut down, and I know you don't want that." He stared at me for a moment longer. When I didn't say anything back, he sighed. "Look, okay, I can give you a bit more information. I can't promise it'll make the choice any easier, but that's not my problem. First off, take yourself. There's a reason it's you I'm talking to right now, Mike. A reason you're the one that's still awake. Do you know what it is?" I don't. "It's because you're the best one. The best person on this plane. You're the pick of the bunch." I'm what?" "You're the best, morally speaking. You've got the most points. Mad, isn't it? I know that's what you're thinking, and I'll admit it. It is sort of hard to believe. You're decent enough, but you're not that great. That's the thing though. For whatever reason, it's a pretty low-scoring bunch on this plane. No saints on this aircraft, let me tell you, and more than just a few bad ones. The old man sitting 3 rows in front of you has killed 4 little girls, if you can believe that. Started when he was a teenager and got a taste for it, never got caught. And there's a woman in business class who knocked down a teenager when she was drunk at the wheel a few years back and just kept on driving. Never got caught either. But let me tell you, the guilt is eating her up. And see the fat bloke on the far side of the plane in the aisle seat? He tried to... Enough! The stranger's words were streaming into my head like insects. I felt ill. The only thing I knew for certain right then was that I wanted him to stop talking. Needed him to stop talking. Just leave me alone and let me sleep, please. I can't leave you alone, but I'm afraid you have to choose first. The clock's ticking. You can close your eyes and go back to sleep right now without saying anything else, and all this will go away. But I do mean, it'll all go away. Or you can ask me to leave one more time, and I'll take that to mean you're picking option number 2, the passing it on option. Just remember though, Mike, the group you're in limbo with here aren't a very good bunch, but the next lot I pay a visit to might be. I stared at him, and he stared right back. Stared at me with eyes that were now a stony grey. I've seen those eyes every single night since, in my dreams. I see them when I wake up too, and when I shut my own eyes in the shower and the hot water pours down my face. I see them when I sit at the breakfast table, scrolling my phone to look at the day's headlines. To look for a very specific type of headline. "I want you to leave," I muttered. "I want you to go away and leave me alone." I could try and tell you that I didn't know what I was saying at the time, that I still thought he was nothing more than a weird guy talking crap to me on a flight. But I can't tell you that. We both know I'd be lying. The stranger grinned across at me. For just a second, the low lighting in the cabin flickered around us. As it did, I had the sense, so fleeting that I can't be sure I didn't imagine it, that I could see the outline of the bones beneath his skin, that I could see the jagged shape of his skull, hiding just below the pale flesh of his face. Then the lights flickered back on, and the man got to his feet. "It was good chatting to you, Mike," he said as he moved into the aisle. "You take care of yourself." I could suddenly hear rustling and movement around me. The sound of the other passengers shifting in their seats. At the far end of the plane, a member of the cabin crew bustled through the blue curtain between business class and economy. She held out a bottle of water to a passenger near the front, smiling and saying something I couldn't catch. 3 rows ahead of me, an old man stood up from his seat and stretched. I looked around for the stranger who'd been sitting next to me, but he was already gone. He never came back. I still see him though. Like I said before, I see him every single day. In the quiet moments when I'm alone and my mind has nothing to do but think. When I lie in bed at night, struggling to sleep. That's when I see his cold, grey eyes watching me, judging me. And when I finally read a story about a plane going down somewhere, maybe with a failed engine over the Atlantic, or maybe just disappearing off the face of the earth, like they sometimes do, that's when I'll know. That's when I'll know someone out there made a choice that I never could. I don't remember my sister. To hear my dad tell it, I met her a total of 3 times in my life. The first time was on the day I was born. My dad even has a picture of the 2 of us together on his phone. It's terrible quality, like the colours have been bleached out of the image, leaving everything in washed out shades of beige. Our forms appear dotty and blurry in the half-light. I'm a tiny thing, with wrinkled and newborn reddened hands. My head looks like a potato. My sister is holding me to her chest, curled over me, looking up at the camera from under her hair with a smile on her face. I always thought it looked a little bit like she was about to cry. The second time I met her, I was about a year or so old. Dad took me to the house where my sister lived with her mom and her stepdad. He says that she played with me on the carpet of her bedroom for an hour or 2 before Dad took me home. The last time, I had just started speaking. I can kind of remember this time a little bit if I really focus on it, but I only remember in blurry fragments of feeling, scent and touch. It's hard to focus on, like all memories made before you are 3 or 4 years old tend to be. Dad and I met her at the mall. We got pizza, I think. I remember the way the greasy food tasted, and I remember, of all things, that my sister's eyes were very blue, just like mine. And that was that. Dad doesn't talk about her. When he does, it's because I ask. Once, when I was 10 or something, a teacher assigned us a project to create a family tree. When I was rooting around in photo albums, back when people still kept physical photo albums, I found a picture of her. It looked like a school photo. She was posing in front of one of those tacky, nondescript backgrounds that all schools use. When I showed it to Dad, he smiled. He told me that she was just about my age in that picture. He said that twice every year, for his birthday and for Christmas, my sister would send him a copy of her school picture and a little note. I asked how old she was now. Dad thought for a second. 17 or 18, I think. I didn't put the picture in my project. I never asked him why I didn't know her. It was something I never questioned. Like the rising and setting of the sun will rise every morning. I don't know my sister. The sun will set every night. He never offered any explanation besides, family can be tough sometimes, kiddo. I never pushed for anything more. One thing I'll never forget though, is how eerily similar we looked. The face staring back at me from that stupid school picture was almost my own. When I am 15 years old, I wake up to someone in my room. It's not Dad, it's not Mom. There's a stranger in my room. Someone is sitting on the end of my bed. It's too dark to make out any of their features. It's darker than I can ever remember it being in my room before. Honestly, I never felt darkness like this. I knew my hands were trembling around my blankets, but I couldn't see them for how thick and clawing the dark was. My voice was stuck somewhere between my gut and my chest, and even though every part of me wanted to scream, no sound escaped. I never even opened my mouth. But it did. There wasn't someone sitting on the end of my bed. There was something sitting on the end of my bed. It wasn't human. I felt it so clearly in that moment. The undeniable inhumanness of the being sitting at the edge of my bed. They looked human, just like any person, kind of small, sitting so perfectly still. But it was the way the darkness clung to the shape of the figure that told me its true nature. It was the way that, of all the things, I couldn't perceive for how oppressive the darkness was. I could see the shape of it, clear as day. Shoulders, a head, 2 arms and legs, all there. But at the same time, all wrong. Incomprehensibly, horribly, achingly wrong. It feels like looking at a person you think you know from a distance. Is that my mom, you wonder? Looking at the back of a woman with dark hair in a department store from 50 feet away. Is that my best friend from elementary school? You ask yourself, staring at the back of the head you think you used to sit behind in 3rd grade English class. Is that my sister? I knew it in an instant. Undeniably, irrefutably, this thing at the edge of my bed was my sister. The knowledge rose up in me like a wave, and the revelation of it knocked me down. I wanted to ask what's going on. My heart was pounding too hard for me to form any words. I don't mean to scare you, it answered suddenly. Its voice was like a great bubbling coming to you from the bottom of a well. I'm scared, I thought in terror. I'm so scared. Sorry, it said in reply. The thing is, I hadn't said anything out loud. I just want to ask you something. I couldn't say anything in return. Something about his voice unsettled me in a deep and primal place. It made my bones vibrate with terror. Is he good to you? I didn't process the question at first. I was too busy noticing, for the first time, that the thing hadn't moved. It dawned on me with sick horror. Whatever it was, your sister, a part of my brain offered, it didn't need to move its mouth to speak. Not even its chest rose or fell. But sure, it had to be breathing, I thought to myself. It wasn't. Is he good to you? It repeated, insistent. Suddenly, it was like a vice had lifted from around my lungs. I could answer. Who? I whispered, my voice a quivering rasp. Dad, something answered from deep inside of me. The thing hadn't spoken. It was like the knowledge had just come to me. One moment I had a question. The next, the answer was right there, settled at the tip of my tongue, like it had been there all along. Yes, I replied, tasting my own silent tears as I opened my mouth. He's so good to me. The thing hummed, and it was like the whole universe vibrated with the sound. I tried to stifle a sob as it came out as a hiccup. The thing made no indication of having heard it. Nonetheless, I was desperate to silence myself. I was terrified that it would suddenly turn violent, like a wild animal, if I spooked it. I'm no animal, it spoke. What are you? It smiled, tender and aching. "I am what grows in the absence of a name," it told me. "Sometimes, when things are loved and left behind, abandoned to a slow and stinging decay, something else grows in its place. I'm like the moss on a fallen log," it said. "I was not born the first time you forgot to call, nor was I born the second time, nor the 12th. I was not born in a single skipped visitation or a one-off forgotten birthday. I was born through tears and silence and conversations never had. I was born between the spaces of memory and the pages of an old photo album. I was born wondering when a lesson is truly a lesson learned. Is it something learned when the ache of disappointment becomes familiar, or is it truly learned when there is no disappointment left at all, because you've long stopped expecting something different? I was born in the same way a dead leaf falls off a tree. I was born as a husk of a thing, a time long past. I was born because he didn't tell you my name, and because you never asked." It leaned forward, and a lightning bolt of terror shot like molten lava through my veins. I was burning with it, the fear and the pain, and I recoiled as much as my fear-frozen limbs would allow. Its shadowy hand touched my face, but it felt like nothing at all. Suddenly, its face was clear to me, clear as day. It was like turning up the brightness on a photo edit and seeing a picture emerge from the screen in real time. The face of the thing was my own, identical, even down to the tear tracks on our face. When is a lesson learned? I opened my mouth to speak, and in an instant, the darkness had lifted. It was daylight in a heartbeat. I was still sitting just as I had been moments ago, drenched in sweat and shivering under the weight of my horror. But my room was cast in warm morning light. I could hear steady traffic on the street outside. My heart raced like it never had before. The impression of bright blue eyes was seared into the back of my eyelids, like the floaters you see after staring at the sun for too long. I stood, tears still rushing down my cheeks, a cry for Dad forming on my tongue. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, it was like it was never there at all. The urge to call for him had dissipated suddenly, just like the tendrils of that awful, horrible nightmare. I got a glimpse of myself in the mirror of my vanity. Same old face. I rubbed tears out of my blue eyes. I sat back down on my bed. When is a lesson learned? I thought, and kept his name shut up inside my head. No matter what you see in the coming months, regardless of how convincing it might seem, know that I didn't want to die. I'm going to take all possible steps to prevent my predetermined demise. But if I don't make it, I need at least someone to know what really happened to me. I'm not, nor have I ever been, a remarkable person. I've never been terrible, but I never did great deeds either. To put it bluntly, ever since I left high school, I found my place in eternal mediocrity. Honestly, being perfectly average didn't bother me much while growing up. Life was decent. I didn't struggle, and it felt like I had an overabundance of time to improve myself. But once I entered my 30s, the time I'd wasted started to wear on my confidence, and a bout of anxiety invaded my otherwise peaceful existence. In order to make myself feel better, I decided to look through my old home videos, figuring that maybe I could get an inkling as to where I lost my passion for living. I dug through my parents' basement while they were at the market to look for the long since forgotten memories. We hadn't filmed anything since the death of VHS tapes back in the early 2000s, but with some luck, the infinite procrastination abilities possessed by my father meant that both the tapes and the player still waited idly by in the dust-covered bods. I found a box marked Home Videos. It was far more than I ever remembered filming, but it already started to set at least some inspiration and drive within the films. So, with Davies highlights 1985 to 2006 and inserted it into the player. Though some of the footage was more than 3 decades old at that point, the tape itself was rather new, or at least as new as VHS tapes could possibly be. It meant that someone had transferred the footage to a newer tape to preserve the film, probably my mother. It had to be rewound, and as I did, I poured myself a glass of cheap whiskey while listening to the loud whirring sound of the tape being dragged back to its beginning. Then I hit play. A poorly focused picture came to view, partially covered by the date, reading January 5th, 1985. It was myself as a baby, barely out of the womb, and my mother was the person behind the camera. She cooed and made funny hand gestures to get me to smile, which I did diligently as she laughed in joy at her wrinkly little creation. I sat through half an hour of footage, watching myself grow up, and though I had no recollection of these events, it felt nice to see that I once lived a carefree life of joy and exploration. Everything felt amazing, and before I knew it, Christmas of 1989 had rolled around, one of my very first happy memories. 4 years old and wearing an oversized Santa hat, I sat on a carpeted floor and fiddled with a colourfully wrapped Christmas gift. Cheerful music played in the background, and a dog ran around, excited about the torn wrapping paper littering the floor. The dog eventually ran over to my young self and started to playfully pull on my present while I attempted to push it away, all the while laughing my heart out. It was a wonderful scene to behold, and though I had a vague memory of that day, my first Christmas to remember, I had absolutely no recollection of ever owning a dog. Don't get me wrong, I love dogs. In fact, I always wanted one, but due to horrible allergies that developed during my childhood, my parents always kept me away from the furry and lovable creatures. My first thought was that the dog belonged to some other family member, but as the years went by, the dog proved a faithful companion and made several appearances on the tape. Though the footage was clearly real, and I was the center of it, I couldn't, for the life of me, remember the dog. He, Doug, followed me around until the age of 12, where it suddenly stopped showing up on the tape, presumably passed away from old age. But it wasn't discussed any further in any of the other clips. I kept watching through my primary school years, then high school, and finally college. Everything was exactly how I remembered it, every minute detail matching my memory of life, except for the dog. As the tape neared its end, the date read October 7th, 2006. I was filming myself out with some colleagues from my part-time job. We were just having a few drinks after work, and though it wasn't a particularly exciting evening, I remember feeling so happy, absolutely certain of my place in the world. Everyone was laughing, and we seemed to have a genuinely great time. The evening went on, and my memory turned hazy, while the footage turned more sloppy. As it often goes with an overabundance of alcohol, there were holes in my memory from that night. The screen cut to black for a few seconds, and once the picture returned, someone was filming me from the other side of the bar. Whoever held the camera, they weren't one of my friends, nor did I seem to pay them any attention. On the footage, I still sat with a couple of my colleagues at the table, just finishing up my final beer before getting up to pay the tab. As we left the bar, the cameraman followed us, keeping his distance. We didn't acknowledge his presence. Unbeknownst to us, a stranger had gotten a hold of my camera, and in my drunken state, I never realized. He kept following us down the street as my friends dropped me off into a taxi. The clip ended, and the screen cut to black for a full minute. I wondered if the tape had reached this end, but the timer kept counting up. Once the picture returned, I was met by a dark scene. The camera was pointed towards a dimly lit road and slowly panned along the street. Small pieces of debris and chunks of cloth littered the road, all accompanied by a vague crackling sound in the distance. Before long, the picture showed a mangled car wreck, partially on fire. The cameraman moved closer to the wreck. I gasped in shock as I saw the severity of the crash. The driver's head had been smashed beyond recognition by the steering wheel. He'd suffered a quick, unexpected death, but the passenger, I, was still alive. It zoomed in on my mangled body as I desperately tried to get free from my seat, but I was stuck under twisted metal and my broken legs had been caught within it. The fire spread slowly at first, and the cameraman stood by idly, watching as it reached my body. Still, I didn't notice anyone filming me. The fire started to spread quicker, and I screamed in agony as it climbed up my body towards my face, my clothes fusing to my skin and my face charring from the heat. After the fire had burned away most of my skin, killing each of the nerve endings, I stopped screaming, though I never stopped moving. Not until my muscles had stopped functioning did I finally go quiet. I'm not sure how long the scene lasted, nor do I care to go back and check. I sat, frozen in fear, as I listened to each sound of my pleading screams until the moment I fell silent and finally died. My life had ended, on camera, the 7th of October, 2006. That was just the end of the first tape. I sat, speechless, trying to figure out if I had fallen victim to some sick prank, or if the footage showed an alternate version of myself that never made it out of college. I took out another tape and read the title. Adam Davies, Highlights, 1985 to 2002. With extreme trepidation, I removed the first tape and inserted the second into the player. Be it morbid curiosity or a desperate need to find answers, I decided to watch another. The footage was almost identical to the first tape, but no dog ever showed up in the film. Instead, the only notable change to my life was the fact that my grandfather died in 1999 instead of 1993, and that the color of my first car changed from black to red. I kept forwarding to the very end of the tape, only watching bits of clips along the way. Once at the end, the day was dated November 15th, 2002. It was a party, and though too young to legally drink, it hadn't stopped me from enjoying the occasional house party. I remember leaving the place around midnight, after being rejected by my crush, and walked the 2-mile journey home, alone in the dark. As I walked, someone followed me in the distance, filming me without my knowledge. just as with the first tape. I crossed the street and took a shortcut through an alleyway and was immediately cut off by a hooded figure. The scene was filmed from too far away to hear what was happening, but the hooded person pulled out a gun and I lifted my hands up in response and immediately froze. Whether it was supposed to be a robbery or a hostage situation, I didn't know. I just kept holding my hands up high while the robber erratically waved the gun around. Before I could defuse the situation, the gun went off and hit me point blank in the throat. I fell to the ground, clutching my throat. While I lay there, desperately trying to slow the bleeding, the cameraman approached me with slow, patient steps. This time, I noticed the stranger approaching, and I stared into the camera as I gasped for air, unable to call out for help. It took me less than a minute to bleed to death, the camera continuously getting closer to my panicked face until the moment I took my last, gargled breath. Then, it got to black. In 2002, I died alone on the street, never knowing why. The same scene kept repeating itself for each of the recordings. Every time, small details were changed, memories that didn't make sense, things that didn't happen, but they always ended with my untimely death. On September 29th, 2004, I drowned as my car plunged into the river. The window didn't open and I couldn't break through the windshield. On January 13th, 2005, I fell off a cliff and broke my legs while hiking alone in a neighbouring city. The fall caused an open fracture which severed one of my arteries, and it took me a full hour to bleed out as I desperately tried to crawl for help. 4 deaths, each filmed by a stranger, never offering a helping hand, never speaking a single word. I returned to my parents' place with a box of tapes and demanded to know what the hell was going on. They took one glance at them and denied knowing about their existence. Despite my father's extreme laziness, he'd long since gotten around to digitizing the footage, putting it on a hard drive and storing it in a fireproof safe. They showed me the home videos they made, and everything appeared just as I remembered it, with no horrific death at the end. The tapes had to have been put in the basement recently, as a flood had destroyed most of the stuff stored there only a year before while I was abroad. Whoever had put the videos there, it wasn't my father. Following the conversation with my parents, my first instinct was to throw the tapes in a fiery pit and forget they ever existed. But saner thoughts prevailed. I had to talk to the police to figure out who had made them, and more importantly, how. I loaded them into my car, checking over each of the titles once more, when I noticed one marked Highlights 1985 to 2020. I stopped, dead in my tracks, and just stared at the tape in my hand. It was bizarre enough to hold a cassette dated in the future, but the fact that I already knew its ending horrified me even further. After what felt like an eternity of contemplation, I decided to see what the tape had to offer, a glimpse into my near future, for better or for worse. If it revealed any details, maybe I could get the chance to escape whatever fate had in store for me. I stared intently at each memory depicted on the television screen, desperate to look for any deviations from my memory. If I was lucky, it was another reality altogether. But no matter how hard I tried to look for any discrepancies, it perfectly matched up my life as I knew it. Once the tape got to December 2019, I took a deep breath and paused the video for a moment. Maybe I should have let the police deal with it. If fate is predetermined, then how could I even prevent it? But I had to know what would happen to me. The urge was irresistible. I hit play once more. The date read December 17th, 2019, and the picture revealed a cold, grey hospital room. I was there, holding my unconscious mother's hand as she took a last breath and fell eerily silent, as if her presence had left the world. The doctor in the room assured me she didn't feel any pain, that she was at peace, but the actual cause of her death never came up. Whoever filmed it didn't seem to take part in the interaction, just like with the other clips. The stranger simply observed us, unnoticed by anyone actually in the room. The clip ended rather abruptly, cutting to black, remaining empty for a full minute. Once it faded back in, the date read January 24th, 2020. I saw myself sitting in what looked like a dirty motel room, one I couldn't recognize. I kept my hands folded over my lap as I sat on the edge of the bed. I was clearly distressed and paid little notice to the cameraman in the room. It went on like that for a couple of minutes, me muttering some incomprehensible, panicked sentences and the camera remaining focused on my hands. Suddenly, I lifted my head towards the cameraman with pleading eyes. "Please, I don't want to do this. Don't make me do it. I don't want to. I don't want to," I said with a trembling voice. The cameraman remained silent, but the look on my face said enough. I was horrified, and it was clear that whoever filmed me was coercing me to do something against my will. I lifted my hands up from my lap to reveal a knife. Just a run-of-the-mill pocket knife, but threatening nonetheless. My hands shook as I once more begged for mercy. I don't wanna. Please, don't make me do this." Then I directed my attention to the knife, and without hesitating any further, I plunged it into my wrist, dragging it up along my arm towards my elbow as I winced in agony. I sat motionless on the bed as viscous blood poured from the cut. The camera kept focusing on me as the life slowly drained from my body. Minutes passed, and I dropped dead on the floor, letting out a final breath before succumbing to blood loss. The tape ended with the familiar jagged lines and grey screen, with a high-pitched, monotonous beep, the only thing left to keep me company. Following the last tape, I headed straight to the police station and handed over the tapes. They were hesitant at first, but quickly came around as they saw the footage. Of course, their explanation was more within the realm of logical possibilities, that someone had altered the footage and created a doctored video. Though they took it seriously, as a threat to my life, they swore they'd keep me safe while they looked into it. Unfortunately, without a perpetrator, it would be hard. After getting home, I sat myself down by the phone and waited for the police to call me with any updates, though I knew if anything came up, it would take possible that it's another reality, and that I'll be fine. Maybe it's just a sick prank, and not someone that can literally see into the future. Those are all just hopeless thoughts. Because about an hour ago, I received a call from my dad. He told me that my mom collapsed in the bathroom and that they're taking her to the hospital. He keeps reassuring me that she'll be fine. But I know better. In a few weeks, my mom will be dead. And then shortly after. I'll follow. My son Josh is a great kid. He's always been the quirky and curious type, taking apart watches, toys, and the like, just to see if he can put them back together again. His curiosity, however, took a dark turn when his mother died. Josh became a different kid after that. He suddenly became obsessed with the notion of death and what it means. Thus, it came as no surprise when I found out what he had decided to do for his science fair project. "I'm testing the line between life and death, Dad." What do you mean, buddy?" "Watch this." Josh seized my iPhone, which had been resting on the table, and flung it into the kitchen sink before I could stop him. "Josh!" Josh turned the water on and seized the can opener, whacking my poor phone repeatedly. The screen cracked and the phone itself died. I wanted to yell, but I knew that that wasn't the right thing to do. I had to discipline him some other way. "Josh, why would you do that? Do you know how much it's going to cost for me to get that fixed?" "Don't worry, Dad. You won't have to pay for anything." He picked the phone up out of the sink and ran upstairs to his room. I stared after him, shaking my head. I seethed about my son's troubling spontaneous behavior all day at work. When I got home, however, I found my iPhone, screen completely fixed and all. I picked it up, studying it, and found that it was working as if nothing had happened to it at all. "Buddy?" Josh came running down the stairs, goggles over his eyes, and a PlayStation controller in his hand. "Who did you get to fix this? And when did you get the money to pay for it?" Josh tilted his head. "What do you mean? I did it myself. That was my first experiment for my project, Dad. I'll move on to phase 2 and document everything tomorrow." I watched, confused, as he ran back up the stairs. I had no idea what he was up to, but I was just happy that I didn't have to pay an arm and a leg to get my phone fixed or to get a new one. Josh's little experiment seemed harmless. Then came phase 2. I walked into the kitchen the next. Josh was standing in front of the counter, a pigeon strapped down. "What in the world are you doing?" Josh held up a large pair of scissors. "It's phase 2. Now watch this." I lunged towards the counter, but it was too late. In one swift move, Josh had decapitated the helpless bird. There was a sickening clipping sound, and then the blood was leaking all over the cutting board and my kitchen counter. This time, I lost it. "Josh, what the hell is the matter with you? Why did you do that?" Josh looked frightened by my reaction, as though he hadn't expected me to lose my mind after watching him kill an innocent animal. "Dad, I already told you. It's phase 2. I dropped him off at school and called a psychiatrist. Maybe his mother's death had hit him harder than he was letting on. I have heard stories about serial killers killing live animals when they were children, and I'll be damned if my son turned into a killer. I scheduled an appointment for the next day. When I got home, I found Josh sitting on the couch in the living room, writing in his journal. His poster board for his project was leaning against the wall by the TV. I couldn't help but notice that there was bird crap next to the TV as well. "Josh, what is..." A pigeon swooped past my head and landed on the couch, cooing softly. I jumped at it, hoping to grab it before Josh could, but he made no moves. The pigeon shot back up into the air, out of my reach. "Why is there another bird in here? I swear, It's not another bird, Dad. It's the same one from earlier today. Josh and I stared at each other for a few seconds. I was sizing him up while simultaneously wondering what the hell had suddenly gone wrong. That can't be Josh. You cut that bird's head off, remember? Yeah, and I put it back on. I brought him back. This project is going really, really well, Dad. I'll beat Cindy Piggins for sure this year. I was entirely positive that Josh had just captured another bird and was losing his mind. But when I checked the garbage can, the bag that I had placed the decapitated bird in was gone. This had gone past the point of too far. Josh had gotten rid of the corpse and was attempting to convince me that he had somehow raised it from the dead. This was meticulous and premeditated. I really did worry about my son, and I'm not ashamed to say that I slept with my door locked that night. Well, until about 2 in the morning, that is. I was woken by the last thing you want to hear at 2 in the morning. Someone beating non-stop on your front door. Well, beating may be a harsh word. Whoever was knocking was doing it forcefully, but there was not much strength behind the knocks. Still, it scared the hell out of me, but not nearly as much as the sight of Josh standing in the living room, white as a sheet, staring at the door. "Josh, what are you doing out of bed?" Josh turned to me, his eyes wide in terror. "What? What's the matter, pal? Go back upstairs. I'll figure out who this is." "Don't open the door, Dad. I messed up." The slow knocking continued behind him. Messed up? How? Josh stared me in the eyes. "I wanted to do something really good for Phase 3, so I brought Mom back." Knock, 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 knock. "Joshua, your mother has been dead for almost 2 years. This isn't funny." I made a move for the door, but Josh jumped in front of me, grabbing my hand. Don't open it, Dad. Don't open it." He and I are still sitting in the house. The knocking has stopped, but now there is a clawing at the window. I keep asking my son if he can undo this mishap, but he says only one thing. "I'm going to beat Cindy Piggins for sure this year." I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I stole a look over my shoulder as I watched the bushes behind me begin to part as whatever was chasing me began to emerge. Before I could catch the sight of the beast, I felt my body make contact with a solid concrete wall. I winced in pain as my breath was forced out of my lungs from the impact. I crouched and slowly began to try to catch my breath. "I've got to slow my heart down," I thought to myself as I began to slow my breathing down and focus on what to do next. The creature that chased me would be on me in seconds if I didn't find a way past this wall. My eyes scanned over the concrete wall that seemed to span for as far as the eye could see. My eyes soon landed on a small hole close to where I was standing. It was roughly the size of a manhole. An ear-piercing shriek sounded behind me as I looked behind in horror. The beast was now fully emerged from its spot in the trees. From what I could see in the darkness, it looked part rodent, part arachnid, part humanoid, if that even makes sense. Needless to say, I didn't waste any time in scrambling into the little tunnel. It was barely big enough for me to crawl on my hands and knees. Heart's beating too fast, I reminded myself as I began to slow my breathing and clear my head. I then suddenly felt the walls of the tunnel begin to brush against my sides and back. I stopped for a second and realized that the tunnel was growing more narrow as it went on. The creature's screech echoed off the tunnel walls. It must have found the entrance. I could hear its claws scraping just several feet behind me. There was no going back now. I sank to my stomach and began to army crawl forward as fast as I could. Soon, it got to the point where I couldn't even fit my hands by my side anymore. In the pitch black, I couldn't see if I was heading towards a dead end or an exit. I could feel the creature behind me as its long antennae began to brush against the back of my legs. I was almost within reach. I squirmed forward, hand outstretched in front of me. My heart began to race as I suddenly noticed that there was water beginning to flow freely into the tunnel. It poured quickly around me, and I soon found myself half submerged within seconds. I lifted my head back and drew in one final breath before the water went over my head. My body suddenly stopped as I felt the walls closing around me tightly. I was stuck. My lungs burned as the last of my oxygen was spent, and a searing pain shot through my body as one of the creature's claws dug into the calf of my leg. There was nothing else I could do. I closed my eyes and began to focus on slowing my heart down. Then, suddenly, I could hear the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Light suddenly erupted around me, and I sat up to the sound of cheers and applause. The dome above my bed I was lying in lifted, and I stood to my feet. I stood on a stage surrounded by cameras. There were several domes around me, all but one of them empty. From the only other occupied one contained a burly figure who also stood to his feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed over the speakers, "I give you our final contestants." The game was simple. The contestants were to lie on their backs in what we refer to as the dome. While inside, we would be put into a coma-like state while small electrodes were gently placed on our temples and chests. The ones on our chest were attached to a Holter monitor, and the ones on our temples came from a neurostimulator, all done by professionals, of course. While inside the simulation, we would be put into several scenarios for 5 minutes at a time. Each scenario would be based on our worst fears. While inside the simulation, our heart rates would be closely monitored, and if we were to reach over 110.1 beats per minute, we would be forcibly ejected out of the simulation and automatically forfeit the match. The entire simulation would be projected on the big screen for the audience to watch from our point of view. If the contestant was ejected, the screen would fade to black to the sound of a comical chicken clucking echoed through the speakers, much to the amusement of the crowd. There were 9 levels altogether, 1 being silly childhood fears, and 9 being 5 minutes in actual hell. I remember the first one for me. I was standing in a dark basement of an abandoned building as hundreds of rats scampered across the floor around my feet, the occasional one darting up the side of my leg or leaping onto my sweat-stained body. This was a recurring nightmare I used to have, based on a childhood memory when I accidentally disturbed a rat's nest after being dared to go into the abandoned basement of my friend's house. Although the sight immediately made me uneasy, I didn't get as worked up as I expected. The simulations that proceeded went on as such. Walking through a pitch-black tunnel as strange whispers echoed across the walls, climbing up a steep ladder so high off the ground I could barely see anything above the clouds, lying paralyzed as dozens of centipedes crept over my bare skin, being stranded in the open ocean as dark figures surf phobias I used to have in the past. The dark, heights, centipedes, and the open ocean. By the end of the 5th simulation, only 10 contestants remained who didn't chicken out. The next ones were a little more than unsettling. They were downright gruesome. The 6th one, I found myself tied to a bed in a dingy hospital as doctors began to perform surgery on me while I was still conscious. I lay there, paralyzed, unable to move as I felt the scalpel dig into my soft flesh and they slowly fell through the ice. As I ran to her aid, the hole that she fell through immediately became frozen over as I began to pound the ice with my bare fists over and over again until my knuckles bled, the whole time watching her as she slowly sank further and further out of sight. That one nearly did me in. At first, it was after the 8th simulation that played in my crippling claustrophobia, I can never really find anything I truly excelled in. This off in this final challenge. The 9th stage was unknown to everyone who could not see it. The screens were blacked out for this simulation, showcasing only the words, "the truth," to the live audience. As I entered the dome for the last time, I looked over to Ray, who gave me a confident yet sportsmanlike nod. As I lay onto my back and the technician began to place the electrodes to my body, I wondered what the final simulation could be. Would I be skinned alive by a masked serial killer? Would I be falling head over heels into a dark and endless pit? Or would I find myself face to face with myself, facing the truth that I am my own worst fear? My heart rate began to pick up as my mind raced at the possibilities. "Take it easy," I murmured to myself as I began to slowly inhale through my nose and exhale from my mouth. "You've got this," I told myself as I felt myself slowly begin to drift away, ready to face the truth. Light flooded my vision. As my consciousness entered the simulation, I tensed up, ready for anything, expecting horrors beyond comprehension. My eyes darted about, taking in my surroundings. To my confusion, I discovered the complete opposite. I stood in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by lush vegetation. A gentle breeze blew through the branches and the sun warmed my skin. I relaxed slightly and took in a deep breath. To my amazement, the air tasted sweet, and just the feeling of it inside my lungs filled me with a renewed energy I had not felt before. I took one step forward, my bare feet brushing across the grass. It was then I noticed something completely different. The all too familiar dull ache in my lower back was gone. I slowly reached behind me and ran my hand down the small of my back. The skin was smooth. I felt no scar tissue from the countless surgeries. I placed my hands on my hips and leaned back slightly. There was no pain at all, not even the slightest bit of discomfort. Over the years, I have grown almost accustomed to that pain, and this was the first time since I could remember the pain wasn't there. It felt great. My mind raced. How was this possible? Did I die during the simulation? Was this the afterlife? I then noticed something else. I no longer felt the overbearing weight of my depression and anxiety. Negative thoughts and insecurities were no longer in the back of my mind. I couldn't recall a single bad feeling or painful memory at all. I felt a tear fall from my eye. I wasn't sad. I felt the complete opposite. For the first time in a long time, I genuinely felt happy. I felt at peace with myself and everything around me. With a burst of sudden energy, I found myself running out of the clearing and into the forest. My heart pumped faster as I felt a burst of adrenaline. I have never run this fast before. As I ran through the forest, I took in all the beauty that surrounded me. The earth here was different in a way I can't even describe. As I ran, the earth changed around me. One moment, it was a lush forest with green leaves and colourful flowers surrounding me. The next moment, I was on a mountaintop. I could see the clouds below me from where I sprinted as lightning and thunder lit them up in blinding flashes of blue light. The next, I was on a beach with cool water slashing around my ankles. Next, I was by a river surrounded by towering waterfalls. The mist felt cool and refreshing on my skin as I continued to run faster and faster than before. It was then that I found the entrance to a cave. I slowed down to a stop before I stepped inside. I don't know what caused me to go in. I felt like it was just calling to me, like there was something inside I was meant to see. As I walked forward, the light faded into complete darkness. I stopped suddenly as my hand brushed across the back of the cave. Turning around to head back, I was then surprised to see a dim light begin to fill the inside of the cave. As I looked around me, I saw thousands of lights begin to pierce the darkness. Small, translucent glowworms covered the walls and the ceiling of the cave, their small lights shining like thousands of stars and galaxies. I just stood there, taking in the surrounding beauty. I felt like I was at the center of the universe. I felt like I was on top of the world. I felt like I was in heaven. I never wanted it to end. It was then I heard a distant voice. 50 seconds, the voice said. I snapped out of my trance and looked around me in confusion. One by one, the glowing lights began to fade out as the darkness began to creep back in. 40 seconds, the voice said. The countdown, I thought by myself. I was still in the simulation. 30 seconds, I heard, louder this time. My heart began to race as I all of a sudden felt panic begin to set in. No, I was not ready to leave. I wanted to stay here. 20 seconds, the voice droned as the darkness began to creep closer and closer. No, I shouted in fear. No, you can't take me back. 10 seconds, the voice said indifferently. No, I screamed again as the last of the lights began to fade out. I'm not ready to go back. You can't make me go back. The voice began to count down from 10 to 1. I reached out in desperation, trying to catch the last of the fading lights before it was snuffed out. But it was too late. I pounded against the cave walls with all my strength, screaming until my lungs felt raw, my heart pounding in my chest. After everything I'd been through, my worst fear was the thought of returning to reality. I sat up in a panic. I shielded my eyes as the lights from the stage blinded me temporarily. I felt a sharp pain as I sat up from my lower back. We have ourselves a winner! The voice of the announcer boomed through the speakers as the crowd got out of their seats and cheered. I began to sweat as the dream fully faded away and reality slowly sank in. All of my pain, my discomfort, all of my negative thoughts seemed to be amplified as I could barely stand up out of the dome. The air tasted bitter and smelled sour. The room was hot and muggy. the floor below my feet hard and uncomfortable. As the announcer stepped forward to congratulate me with an outstretched hand, I reached out and grasped him by the front of the shirt. "Send me back," I begged him. "I wasn't finished yet." "No, you weren't," he said, half laughingly. "But you were seconds away from the 5-minute mark. That's a record." "You don't understand," I shouted. "I can't take it anymore. Please, send me back." I began to wrap my hands around his throat in anger. I was then jerked back and was roughly put into a chokehold. I threw my head back in retaliation, feeling it collide with a burly security guard's face. His grip loosened slightly, and I fell face first onto the ground. The crowd began to murmur nervously as I scrambled toward the dome. I grasped the electrodes and clumsily began to try to stick them back onto my temples. It was then I felt a sharp pain shoot through my body as the guard fired his stun gun right between my shoulders. As my thrashing body hit the ground, I noticed movement from the other side of the stage. A group of medical staff and first responders crowded around Ray's dome. The last thing I remember before I passed out was Ray's lifeless eyes as they loaded his limp body onto a stretcher and began to rush him off the stage. The showrunners made a public statement shortly afterward, publicly apologizing to the viewers and explaining that what they had witnessed was not an effect of their machines. It was a mental breakdown due to my medical history. Ray was dead on arrival when we reached the hospital. I overheard the doctor saying it was caused by a ventricular fibrillation during the simulation. For those of you without a medical degree, it means the Marine was scared to death. I was released a few days later. I received an apology letter from the executives of the show, along with my prize money. They added a few zeros to the amount as, quote, "compensation for any sort of trauma I might have experienced during the simulation." I knew hush money when I saw it. Since that day, I feel like I live in constant agony. An agony every one of you feels every single day, but may not be aware of it. A pain you have all grown accustomed to, because it is all you know. A pain you only realize that exists when you have lived 5 minutes without it. You don't know the truth. Life is pain. Every second of our existence. I spend my days longing to return to that simulation, that place where pain does not exist and my mind is at ease. Sometimes in my dreams, I can catch a glimpse of it for a few seconds before I'm quickly thrown back into consciousness. I guess Gibran was right when he said, "Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding." I'd been winterproofing my store when I saw her. She came stumbling towards me, covered in snow, clutching something close to her chest. It was about 13 degrees out, and there hadn't been a customer for a while. I assumed she was lost. People don't just wander by so late at night. When she stepped into the illumination of the streetlight that shone over the lot, I saw what condition she was in, and what she carried. Her clothes were torn and covered in blood. Her face was splattered with the stuff as well. Her hair, dark as the night behind her, had been unevenly cut, strands sticking every which way, at inconsistent and jagged lengths. I stood there, surprised and admittedly afraid. I didn't live in a dangerous area per se, but something about this woman's condition set off a few alarms in my head. Anyway, Bundled up in her scratched and bloodied arms was something wrapped in what looked to be clothes. I immediately feared the worst. A child. But something about the form of it, the tightness of the wrappings, didn't seem quite right. Thankfully, although my gratitude in the end is debatable, it wasn't a kid. She came nearer, and where her face would have been in the bundle if it were a child, I instead saw a mess of sticks, interwoven and fastened by red string. At this proximity, the woman's features were plainly clear as well, and I shuddered at what I saw. She was about 20, and her face had been messed up pretty badly. A grey, half-shredded hoodie barely concealed her pale body from the pervasive cold, and equally tattered jeans provided similar ineffective protection. The wounds, and there were several, had scabbed over, leaving ugly, black traces where presumably deep lacerations had been. Her eyes had been focused on the strange bundle of twigs when she approached, but now, standing before me, she brought her gaze to mine. She had cried at some point in the night, and the tears had dried and left streaks of revealed skin through her otherwise bloodied face. She held the bundle out towards me and muttered something I didn't catch. I can't tell you why, considering the strangeness of it all, but I took it without hesitation. When I had relieved her of the burden, she walked past me, grabbed a screwdriver from my toolbox, and headed back towards the lot. She sat down in the middle where the light shone the most and stared towards the stars. Still holding the bundle, I turned my attention skyward, entranced by the bizarreness of her behavior. I lived a few miles outside of a small town, so there's no major pollution, light or chemical, to blot out the stars. I'm not much of a stargazer, but in that moment, I did truly appreciate the stellar grandeur of it all. Then I heard a gurgling noise and returned my gaze to the lot. The girl sat there, eyes still beholding the stars, with two smiles stretched ear to ear. The first, topmost smile was one you'd see on anyone. The second ran across her neck and splurted blood down her chest. The stains that had dried were replenished, and the screwdriver she had taken was coated in blood up to the hilt. I acted as quickly as I could. I set the bundle down gently on the bench, then immediately cursed myself for treating it like a living child. I sprinted to the girl, and without consciously willing the sequence of actions, I tore my jacket sleeve, wrapped it around her neck, and picked her up. She kept her eyes trained on the sky, and although she occasionally coughed out crimson, her smile never wavered. I brought her into the store and set her down on the register's counter. My phone was charging in the back office, and I would have gone to it, but something about the girl's still blissful face unnerved me. I didn't trust her to not make a second attempt on her life. I had kicked the screwdriver into the street, a regrettable, hasty action, considering it could mess up someone's tire. But there were plenty other things in my store that could do serious bodily harm. I patted her down in the appropriate areas and sure enough found a cell phone. Luckily, it was unlocked. I doubt she would have given me the code if I'd asked. I dialed 911, told them of the situation, and they said they'd be there within a few minutes. I looked over the girl again. Her eyes still stared towards the store windows, although from her supine position, there was no way she could see the night sky. The areas of her face and neck, not covered in blood, had lost even more colour, making the skin appear semi-translucent. At some point, she had clasped her hands across her stomach and put one leg over the other. If I hadn't known of the 4-inch wound across the throat, I'd say she looked pretty comfortable. Hell, she might have been regardless. "One of us has to die." Her voice, despite the slit throat, came out serenely melodious, and it took me a second to reconcile this discontinuity in my head before replying. "Who? Why do you have to die?" Her eyes lingered on the unseen sky for a little while longer, before begrudgingly turning to me. Her smile, which had been more blissful, shifted in nature, as of one you'd seen on a cancer-stricken mother lying to a child about her mortality. "You have to trust me. If I don't die, he has to. You have to kill it. Promise me you'll do that." I was confused, or at least I thought I was. But deep down, I knew to what she had been referring. But why she personified it, I hadn't a clue. So I asked her. She didn't respond, and instead closed her eyes. For a brief moment, I thought she had resigned herself to her injuries, but her chest rose and fell in accordance to what I hoped was steady breathing. I made up my mind that forcing her to speak was a bad idea, and went outside to where I had left it. Still on the bench, wrapped in a shirt, was the bundle of sticks held together by the red string. I unwrapped it, revealing a crude effigy of a humanoid, but not exactly human figure. While you and I have 2 arms and 2 legs and a head atop our shoulders, this figure had 3 upper limbs analogous to arms, and the same number of lower appendages resembling legs. A curled vestigial knob peeked out from its side. A head, or at least a bulbous protrusion that suggested as much, extended not from between the shoulders, but from the chest, jutting out a few inches. The whole thing was about 2 feet tall, and surprisingly heavy despite its compositional material. It was mere framework, bearing nothing in the way of sense organs, orifices, or clothing. A malformed, nude, super-limbed homunculus. Its construction appeared to be something in progress, and honestly, more than a little disturbing. "You have to kill it. Please. The dreamer or the dream. At least one must die." Her voice was projected strongly from within, despite her injuries, and I couldn't help but silently commend the girl for her resilience. But she was plainly delirious. The cold, blood loss, and open neck all assuredly taking a collective toll on her mind. I turned to head into the store and, forsaking my intention of keeping her quiet, planned to ask what the hell the stick figure was. But as I crossed the threshold of the entryway, I saw the clock I kept above the register and froze. The time read 3:22 p.m. Even with daylight savings, it didn't start getting dark until around 4:30 p.m, and there hadn't been any cloud coverage all day. Seeing me, the girl's smile brightened, and her eyes began to water. She motioned for me to hand her the effigy, and I did, unthinking. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" "Yes, for now. At its size and its age, it's still no more than an inquisitive child, staring down at its maker, wondering, observing. But it'll grow. It'll see things, the things we do to each other, and as children do. It'll reenact them, mimic us, thespianize the violence and tragedy. You have to kill it, or it'll kill us, and it won't even know that it had." I heard the sirens in the distance. The girl, having finished her ominous oration, returned her eyes to the preternatural night. Again, I did the same. I was suddenly transfixed, not by the brilliance of the stars, but by their arrangement. Instead of the scattered selection you'd expect to see, I saw 8 lustrous spheres, organized, perfectly distanced from each other. Something about the way they blazed was simultaneously awesome and horrifying. As the sirens drew nearer, I became increasingly aware of the unsettling element, but I couldn't place my finger on what it exactly was. My little spider, I can't bring myself to do what must be done. What mother could. But I've waited too long, and you've grown so much. Maybe you deserve a chance at life, just as we've all had. Then it all clicked. The unnatural arrangement of stars, which suggested design and organization, the strange morphology of the effigy, the too soon arrival of night. While I didn't quite fathom how it could be possible, couldn't even begin to form an explanation, I did understand what I had to do. I raced towards the bundle and wrenched it from the girl's hands. She screamed at me, a shriek full of manic power, but I was strong too, and too fast, and left the store before she could snatch it back. As I stepped into the street, I felt the bundle get hot, intolerably so, forcing me to fling it to the pavement. I retrieved a hammer from my toolbox and smashed the infernal thing, sending pieces of it flying everywhere. Behind me, the girl had clambered off the counter and stood weakly in the threshold, and at the sight of the destroyed effigy, she let out a scream intoned with unfathomable woe, the agonized, unrelatable wailing of a bereaved mother. The sky cleared just as the police arrived. It wasn't instantaneous. It was similar to the parting of clouds, actually. The darkness faded and drifted away, yielding to the light which still had rightful claim to the sky. The police exited their vehicles slowly, in awe of the shift in temperament. While I had been oblivious to the night's unjust arrival, they had no doubt been startled by it. The girl's chaotic, almost insane screams of grief brought their attention back to us, and they approached with their hands on their weapons, unsure what to make of the crazed and sobbing woman. A man knelt before scraps of wood and a sky that had gone through cyclic change in the span of a few hours. I was home by 11 p.m. that night, when proper darkness had arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital and treated. She'll live, but will apparently have a nasty scar for the rest of my life. I was questioned, of course, and I told them what I had told the 911 operator over the phone, leaving out all the business of the effigy. I don't know what the girl told them, and they didn't ask me any questions regarding the premature night. The officers who arrived at the scene did mention that they didn't encounter the darkness until they were about a mile out from the store, leading me to believe that the thing's presence, influence or whatever, hadn't spread to the town. The girl, whose name I learned was Portia, lived somewhere in the area and had actually been reported as missing by another woman with whom she lived. This other woman told police, who then related to me, that Portia had recently been driven to the state of depression after finding out she was infertile. The two women attended a nearby university, where Portia studied arachnology and the other woman studied oneirology. When Portia learned of her infertility, the roommate had tried to console her with discussions about her work and other, less scientifically, though equally intriguing topics. And it was through these discussions that Portia discovered the concept of a tulpa, and subsequently became fixated upon the idea. Shortly after, she disappeared from the apartment, and after a day, the roommate alerted the authorities. I'm not sure what to do with this information. I'd known the girl only about 15 minutes, but I can honestly say it was equally the most profound and terrifying moment of my life. Every time I think back to that moment when I looked up at the sky a second time, I always see them. 8 bright, curious spheres burning in the illimitable heavens. Spheres which belonged to something the girl had called young. Something which spanned for at least a mile in all directions. In a small Massachusetts town 9 miles from downtown Boston, past a thicket of balding trees and roads less traveled, an epidemic has effectively wiped out half of its residents, but the population remains the same. I'm a reporter, freelance. You've never read anything by me. I've only just graduated from a small university in the area with a journalism degree. All it cost was my dignity and the indefinite forfeiture of all contents of my bank account. I'm always looking for work, investigative work, if you will. Best way to do that is to keep up with the news, local and national. Despite my financial situation, I shell out the money to keep my monthly subscription to a litany of newspapers: the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and a few local papers from the greater Boston area. In that respect, and in that respect alone, the morning of November 2nd was no different than any other. Wake up, put on pants, struggle to carry the stack of papers that accumulated on my doorstep, wash the ink smudges off my hands, and read as I drink a cuppa. I didn't see the story immediately. It was only after combing through most of the Boston Globe that I found the article tucked under the Metro section. The story has, for reasons which don't exactly elude me, since been removed from the Globe's website. Mother alleges child abuse in Walsham daycare. Underneath the headline, but above the alluring structure architecture of his text, was a picture of a woman in her early to mid-30s. Her face bore an expression of directionless grief, a bewildering sadness, familiar to those whose lives have been changed in an instant. Her arms, donned with cheap-looking bracelets, were draped with a gentle firmness around her daughter. I reflected on this only momentarily, before becoming completely transfixed on the girl in her grasp. The girl was young, too old to be a toddler, but too young to be an independent child, had long and frizzy blonde hair that pressed across a mother's arm the way broom bristles do when pressed against a hard wooden surface. Her eyes glared into the camera, a light blue penetration that sent a chill through my body and brought about a sudden and inexplicable lightheadedness. I waited for it to subside and continued onto the article. Only in retrospect do I understand what the lightheadedness had been. It was a warning, my body signaling to me that something was wrong. Oh, so wrong. A nudge from the primal and knowing but unconscious and involuntary corner of my brain that links us to our primordial survivalist ancestors, the very same that galvanized them into action when the choice in front of them was often between fight and flight, between life and death. On some level, I must have known this. So why did I continue to look? For the same reason drivers will rubberneck as they pass a gruesome and likely fatal pileup on the highway. It is a light and distanced brush with death, the inevitable unknowability. There is something attractive about encroaching the unknowns and the unknowables, to dip one toes into the void. What was that quote my philosopher major and pretentious jackass college roommate had written on our shared whiteboard? The one by Nietzsche? If you gaze into the abyss, The abyss will gaze back into you, or something to that effect. In the girl's eyes was an abyss, and my eyes were gazing with a focused intensity I've never known before. But Nietzsche was wrong. It felt as though the abyss was looking through me, and that was far, far worse. I trudged onto the article. My stomach was now a solidified mass in the pit of my abdomen, and acid began to sting my throat. My heart beat loudly as though in protest, but I ignored it and read on. Brenda McCarthy, a 32-year-old Walsham resident and mother, took a 5-year-old daughter to the same daycare last week as she had done every workday for the past 3 years. But something deeply troubled her when she picked up Ellie McCarthy that afternoon. It wasn't her, Brenda told me in her home as she fought the onset of tears. My baby girl looked so confused, so distant, and she just didn't seem like herself. When asked what she meant by that, Brenda fell silent for a few moments, perhaps in hesitation, before calling her daughter to me. Ellie McCarthy walked up to her silently, without any of the energy typical for a 5-year-old child. She turned her face upwards at me, with no emotion registered on her young face. Her mother burst into tears. After she regained her composure, Brenda told me that Ellie had exhibited a series of strange behaviour since the car ride home from the daycare. At first, Brenda explained to me, I suspected that she was tired. Took it out, from a day of playing. She is, or she was, a social and sweet girl. But she wasn't sleeping. Her eyes were open, wide open, like she was in shock, like she had seen a ghost. I thought, oh, she must have gotten into an argument with Lexi, her best friend from the daycare. So I asked her if she was okay. You know what she said to me? The tears once again pooled in her eyes and threatened to spill again, but she persisted through them. She said, there's something strange about the daycare lady. She was acting all funny. I asked Brenda if she had said anything else, and she shook her head. She just repeated herself over and over. Her face, she looked so scared, like she was traumatized, hopeless. I pulled the car over and got out and went over to her side. She had no visible bruises or scars, but her stare remained. She trembled at my touch. I observed Ellie as her mother recanted these events. Her eyes remained fixed on me as her mother sobbed and held her. Her mother continued describing her suspicion that the so-called daycare lady, a 23-year-old Mary Harris, had psychologically damaged and abused the young child. She intends to litigate and believes she has standing to sue the daycare for damages. She says she's working to get in contact with other parents of children in the daycare to build a stronger case. Below the story was contact information for a lawyer's office, undoubtedly Mrs. McCarthy's. I looked at the byline and was not surprised to see the story had been written by Elizabeth Collette. Her writing style had become familiar to me, and she was a journalist I highly respected. Call it journalistic instinct. I shall not, as I do not think so highly of myself. But there was something fundamentally strange, something deeper than misplaced trust in a daycare worker. I didn't know what it was, but my intuition nagged at me and assured me there was. If I had known what I was going to uncover, I would have immediately packed everything I could fit into a suitcase and left everything behind. But journalists do journalism for the same reason a mongoose will attack and eat snakes. It's instinct, and instinct pays little regard to safety, because not every mongoose lives through an encounter with their food. With this in mind, I made my way to grab my keys off the kitchen counter. As I did, I took another look at the article, looked into Ellie's eyes, and shuddered. Begin with what you know and fill in what you don't. For me, that was the first and only rule of journalism. What I knew was that I needed to speak with the McCarthys. I found their address with relative ease. On my way to my car, I searched for Brenda McCarthy under the Property Search tab on the County Appraisal website, found their address and, lucky for me, they lived 5 minutes away. I made it in 3. I parked on the street, locked my car, and approached what would have undoubtedly made the cover of the fall edition of Middle Class Suburbia magazine. A garden of wilting brown roses peppered the front of the house next to a doormat, asking the Lord above to bless this mess. I made a mental note of what I saw. A good journalist is never off duty, and raised my hand to knock on the door. Brenda McCarthy opened the door as my fist was raised to knock on it. This didn't surprise me as much as her appearance did. In the day since the interview, she looked as though she had aged 30 years. The bags under her eyes were in printed markings, and veins painted a map-like navigation system across the pockets. Her eyes bulged out of her skull, beady and glazed over marbles that seemed not to register my presence. The skin on her face was pressed against her skull, pulled taut. If a skilled anatomy student had accompanied me, he would have been able to name every bone in the poor woman's face. The lightheadedness returned, and the borders of my vision turned a light grey haze. Don't you dare pass out, I thought. You're here for answers. This is just another question. I did my best to stabilise myself before I could produce any sound. Hi, Mrs. McCarthy. My name is Eli. I'm a reporter. I wanted to follow up with the story from the Globe. There's something strange about my daughter. About Ellie. She's acting different. Her lips had barely moved as she spoke. If a skilled ventriloquist observed alongside the skilled anatomy student, he would have been green with envy, as the expression goes. Strange. How? I paused, then added, May I come in and ask you a few questions? Under her breath, I heard a nearly silent, There's something strange about my daughter, about El, before it trailed off, although I had a guess as to the rest of what she said. She turned and walked with an unsettling gait, extending her left foot outwards and scuttling her right foot along. She continued to mutter under her breath as she did so. And stupidly, I followed her. Without a word, Mrs. McCarthy sat on the lover's seat in a sofa, placed her hand gently but dispassionately on her lap, and set a gaze once more on me. The sinking feeling of looking into that little girl's eyes returned, and anxiety moulded itself into a ball and settled deep into my stomach. It was like peering off a cliff at the top of a large mountain and acknowledging that, with one misstep, life ends and death begins indefinitely. That feeling of slow recognition that it could all end and a pull towards that end. The nerve endings of my fingertips began to tingle, and then, in a flash, raced down my arms like lightning striking a metal rod. But I had to fulfill my stupid journalistic duties, and so I sat down on the coffee table directly in front of what was left of Brenda McCarthy at 201 Bedford Street. I grabbed the pen and small journal from my coat pocket. I suddenly felt stupid for bringing it at all. How the hell was I going to write this? I looked at Brenda, just below her eyes. It was easier than looking into the abyss. My stomach settled a bit, and my head descended back onto my neck. I gulped once and asked the question again. Mrs. McCarthy, what exactly is happening with your daughter? She said nothing. Her eyes said nothing, and she seemed as though she withered to nothing. I tried a different approach. Quite frankly, Brenda, you look like a mess. You've lost an impossible amount of weight, and I need some answers. Not as a journalist, Brenda. I'm concerned for your safety. Manipulative, sure, but not untrue. She looked emaciated, but I'm not proud of saying what I said. Not like it ended up mattering anyway. She gave me nothing. Not a single damn facial expression or flicker of discernible emotion. The only movement on her face was a light pulse of her eyes as they bulged from their pulled back sockets. Nothing. A blank stare, emotionless, and so eerily still. The tingling in my fingertips returned, and my heart began to thrash wildly in my chest as my breath became shorter and shorter still. Something was wrong with this woman, and she needed medical attention. The thought exited my mind as quickly as it entered, because it was replaced by the incomprehensible reality that I was forced to immediately accept. To my right was the pale and starved and decaying body of 5-year-old Ellie McCarthy. A trail of blood stained the carpet under what remained of her head as it was dragged into the room where her mother and I sat. Her mouth was fixed in a constant gape, and her eyes stared lifelessly, listlessly towards the ceiling, a fossil of a final moment on this earth. My mind processed a disordered and uneven array of thoughts, of flashes that came with the intensity and duration of muscle spasms. Not in words, but images, intangible neon danger, alerting the psyche. Shots of fear signaled alongside my neural pathway in frantic and unfamiliar patterns. The tingling was all over now, and my head felt light enough to float several yards above my body. My mouth began producing excess saliva, and I feared I would expel my stomach contents on the floor. Thud. The hand released the body of the little girl, and it produced a damp thud that made me jump in my seat. Brenda McCarthy kept as still as the deceased. I calmed myself, looked at the figure that brought the body into the room, and immediately screamed. Next to the corpse of the younger McCarthy was a figure that resembled Ellie McCarthy. Her hand dirted with the leaking blood of the body next to her. It was a very much alive Ellie McCarthy, dragging an obviously not alive Ellie McCarthy into the room. But there was something strange about her. They shared the resemblance of twins, perhaps even clones, if that technology indeed exists. Physically, in other words, they were damn near identical. The frizzy blonde hair seemed to cut and paste. The bridge of her nose arced the same way as the girl in the picture. Hell, I'm pretty sure the number of freckles she had matched the number from the dead girl slumped next to her. But it wasn't her. I could tell. I knew from looking at her, into her eyes, into the abyss, that it was not Ellie McCarthy. It was a caricature, a cheap, off-brand imitation, meant to pass off as a living and breathing and thinking and loving human being. Conscious thought awoke again. Only a sliver of it, but enough, and I realized I needed to get out of here now. I made quickly for the door, stopping once to look over my shoulder. Just like Lot's wife, I thought hysterically. Brenda's lips were pulled back. Rotting, coal-black gums, flecked with white bone protrusions from her teeth, a rotted cheddar yellow with Swiss-like holes, stuck out jaggedly as she produced what can only be loosely defined as a grin. As I closed the door and ran out, I swear I heard her tell me that there was something strange about her daughter, and that she was acting differently. I drove towards nothing in particular, and without intention. Police, I thought. I have to go to the police. And tell them what? There's a dead body, a girl, and a mother is clearly sick, and they need my help, and what? Go to the police, tell them you found a dead body being dragged by a carbon copy of the dead girl, and let them think what exactly? Damn, Brenda could be dead by the time they get there. Would they even find a murder weapon? They'd probably wonder why I went there at all. What, because of some hunch about a random back-cover news story? They'll think I'm insane. and there'll be 2 dead bodies and no witnesses. Damn. Okay, let's relax. Police is out of the question, I said to my empty Honda Accord. But I can't do nothing. I have to talk to someone. Elizabeth Colette, famed Boston Globe reporter. I blinked. Yes, Elizabeth. I could talk to her, couldn't I? She had gone to the house, seen the child, spoken with Brenda. Maybe she felt that feeling of dread when looking into Ellie's eyes, past them into the nothingness where her soul should have been. I set my GPS to the address for the Globe and made a U-turn. If I had continued driving, I could have driven onto the highway and continued until I left Massachusetts. But instead, I shared the final moments of Boston Globe's Elizabeth Colette's 42-year existence on Earth. You don't understand. Nor had I expected her to. But there was a certain Boston area reporter that I had to see. Much to my chagrin, the front desk lady stood her ground. Sir, I'm sorry. Unless you have an appointment, you'll have to leave. She wrinkled her nose as she said this, then extended a hand towards the door. I was getting nowhere with her, and time was marching forward, and the body of a little girl rotted and chilled not 10 miles from here. So I went ahead anyway. The surprised cries of, "Sir, sir, you can't go in there," barely registered through my determination, and before I knew it, I'd found the room with a door-adjacent plaque labelled Elizabeth Colette. As I placed my hand on the doorknob to open it, a cold hand grabbed my shoulder firmly and spun me around. It was her, in the flesh. Under different circumstances, I would have been starstruck, a journalistic giant in my presence. But I was on a mission, and lives depended on me. "Excuse me, can I help you?" She spoke with a thick Boston accent. Her eyes narrowed at me, and her brow furrowed. Her tongue stuck out the tiniest bit and licked the right, then left corners of her thinning lips. The front desk lady stood impatiently behind me, arms crossed, an expression furious. Yeah. Her hand still locked onto my shoulder, with the clammy grip of an arcade claw. The name's Elijah Deers. I'm here about the story you wrote about Brenda McCarthy and Ellie McCarthy. I gulped, my mouth suddenly dry and my throat suddenly raw. Her eyes remained fixated in a suspicious slit, her hand on my shoulder. But across her face was the tiniest flicker of emotion. Was it validation? Did she see as I did? I thought it might be. If she had survived, I think I might have asked her. "Ah, yes, the daycare abuse story practically wrote itself." Daycare came out as daycare, something I would have found mildly amusing under different circumstances. What struck me was what I detected beyond her words. Her voice sounded aloof, but her eyes remained interested. What about it? Elizabeth Colette was invested and wanted to have the whole story. She was a good journalist. So I provided a SparkNotes edition of the past several hours, omitting the unnecessary and focusing on the crucial. As I told her, the grip on my shoulder tightened, and when I told her of Ellie McCarthy's fate, her grip tightened into a squeeze that sent a not totally unpleasant chill down the small of my back. When I concluded, there was silence. There was no movement. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the front desk lady standing completely still, arms dangling at her sides. Finally, Elizabeth Colette spoke. "Let me see if I understand. You expect me to believe that some barely graduate college student playing journalist tracked down a grieving mother and an abused daughter based on a hunch about a news story he read?" She loosened the grip a bit. "And when he gets there, get this, he finds the dead daughter and the mother looking like a Holocaust survivor. And, oh wait, let's not forget the best part, next to the body of the dead little McCarthy child was the same kid, but alive. Deborah, you hearing this? The front desk lady, Deborah, didn't respond. I'll give you this. You got balls. But they're good for nothing if you don't got the brains too. She released a hand from its resting place on my shoulder and spoke a final words as Elizabeth Khalid, Pulitzer Prize nominee and human resident of Massachusetts. I'll grant you something though. I smelled something peculiar about that house, but if I saw two of the same person, you bet your ass I would have written about it. Deborah, let's see about getting this young man. As she turned her face to look at Deborah, her mouth opened as if she was yawning, and her eyebrows cocked downwards. I turned to look. The whites of Deborah's eyes had been stained a deep black that streaked across in irregular patterns like spilled ink on clear canvas. Her face had turned paper white, her lips translucent and cracked in jagged, vein-like patterns. Her gaze was fixed on a point somewhere between and beyond where Elizabeth and I stood. Elizabeth looked at me and then back at her. I think she looked into her eyes and began to sway as I did when I peered into that abyss. And, without change to her expression or stance, she began to vomit. Her expulsions had a bulby, yolk-yellow appearance, hard centers amidst runny goo. It made a sickening splat as it landed on the ground, and a wave of nausea flooded my senses. I thought I might faint. The feeling worsened when I realized what it was that Deborah was projectile vomiting. I shadowed a surgeon for part of a surgery for a story I was writing in class for college. I had seen this before. Adipose tissue. Fat. She was throwing up her fat. Her face began to thin, her skin pulling back taut on her face as though held back by clothespins. The black in her eyes danced like clouds during a thunderstorm. Yet she stood still. Oh, so perfectly still. Motionless. Then, all at once, the vomiting ceased. A shallow pool of fat had amassed underneath her feet. A shallow, bubbly pool of organic mass. At first, the tissue remained formless. Until it didn't. Slowly. So slowly, in fact, that I was unsure if I had imagined it. The fat began to pull together and amassing in smaller clumps, then bigger ones. An image of Play-Doh being rolled up into balls came to mind as I teetered and tottered and struggled to find solid ground to stand on. The lightheadedness had returned, and I suddenly felt myself at a distance from my body. My heart began to beat rapidly, and my breath became shorter. A surge of adrenaline shot through me, and I remember one lone conscious thought. I have to get the hell out of here. I screamed, completely involuntary, and turned to Elizabeth, intent on grabbing her and running to my car with her. She stood completely still, eyes fixed on the mass of organic matter in front of her that was beginning to vaguely resemble her former employee. Oh no. I managed to speak as loudly as I could muster. It came out as barely louder than a whisper. Elizabeth. There's something strange about my employee, Deborah. She's acting strange. Her Boston accent had completely disappeared. Her voice delivering a line like a bad high school drama student. Monotone, dispassionate. Oh no, oh no. I looked into her eyes and found myself sinking into the same abyss I discovered at the McCarthy household. On the border of her eyes, I saw trails of blackness circling around like a whirlpool, flushing closer and closer to the middle of her vision. There's something strange about Deborah. She's acting all strange. Elizabeth was gone. I knew that, but I hesitated before leaving her. She looked the same, for now, but something was wrong, and so I took off. I gagged as I stepped into the puddle of what would become Deborah, the front desk lady. a smell I'll never forget. I ran to my car, fumbled for my keys and got in. A bit of Deborah's fat had stuck to the bottom of my shoe, and the smell lingered. I took off my shoe, lowered the driver's side window, and tossed it. The smell was never coming off. I sped down the parking lot, hitting a few parked cars in the lot. I didn't care. As I turned onto Needham Street, a sight imprinted onto my brain. Globs of fatty tissue molded, various models of humanoid beings in various configurations and expressions. All were represented, different phases of development abound. Many were embryonic, in relative terms, recently vomited adipose cells that had begun to clump at the heel of the foot to create the base of the human they just left. Others were legs and a bottom, torso either missing or in the works, but sure to come soon. Some were fully formed beings, standing next to the emaciated corpses of their previous owners who now lay dead on the street. The coloration step seemed to be the last one when they began to adopt the skin tones of their owner. I saw very few that were anything other than the sickly egg yolk yellow with flakes of dried blood peppering the hardening tissue. The ones that were fully formed stood there, as still as the dead. Motionless, their dead selves lay next to them. In a disjointed chorus, I heard several names, followed by some iteration of acting strange, or seem peculiar, or look quaint. Cars were strewn about, trails of yellow guck lining the still open doors and amassing at a critical point. It was a massacre. I turned onto I-90 and drove non-stop until I thought it was safe to stop. In other words, I drove for a while. If I had to estimate at this point, I would say nearly half of the residents of Walsham have been replaced. Maybe more, I'm not sure. It appears to be contagious, but if it is contagious, why have I not begun to change? I've been exposed to several carriers. I looked into their eyes. Is it possible that I'm immune? Am I capable of peering into the abyss without joining it? And if so, are there others like me? Maybe. Of that, I have no way to be sure. I would not stake a life on it. So please, if you hear someone describing that a co-worker, or loved one, or friend is acting strange, or funny, or different, or odd, run. That appears to be the first sign. Do not look into their eyes. Do not communicate with them. Pack whatever you think you'll need to survive for a long period of time, and pack it as quickly as you can, and leave. It started in Massachusetts, and I don't think that's where it'll end.